Hello everyone, I'm Captain Logan and welcome back to the Ruthless and Territorial Comic Vault. Today we're going to take a look at Mars Attacks the Real Ghostbusters. This is a one-shot that came out in 2013 that I missed when it first came out, and I found it at a convention later and was like, oh wait, I never bought that. I gotta add that to my Ghostbusters collection. I buy everything that Eric Burnham does on Ghostbusters, and I try to follow Eric Burnham in general. I like his writing a lot. He's a really great guy, and I try to support him as much as I can. So this is written by Eric Burnham with some really fun, pulpy throwback art that I think does a really good job of capturing both the style of and feel of Mars Attacks and also the Real Ghostbusters, and that is drawn by Jose Holder, who I'm not familiar with. I'm not in love with this art, but I like it a lot for, like just in general, it's not exactly my cup of tea, but then for this material, I think it works really well. It's just like with X-Files, and it's not exactly the same kind of art as that, but where it's this pulpy throwback thing that's really gritty and kind of sketchy. One of the things that's kind of interesting about this is the line it's towing in being the Real Ghostbusters versus regular Ghostbusters, and I kind of wondered and doing that and also being Mars Attacks at the same time. So being a thing that is more pulpy sci-fi, creepy, scary stuff that's not really for kids, but then I roped in with the Real Ghostbusters, which is a cartoon for children, and I think it was a really interesting choice to go with Real Ghostbusters instead of the regular Ghostbusters. For a long time, I always wondered really if there was any distinction at all in comics, because with the Real Ghostbusters, it's it's a cartoony thing. We're taking 2D art and we're translating it to 2D art, and so since the Real Ghostbusters was the movie just done as a cartoon for children, and since the comics, the monthly comics that Burnham was doing, and whenever he comes back to it now, aren't really photorealistic, they still have that 2D animation quality to them. I always wondered really what the difference was. If there really is any contrast between the way the characters are characterized. I thought that the miniseries, and I only read a couple issues of it, I haven't, I need to go back to it and finish it, but I'm sure I'll review it at some point. But the miniseries, Ghostbusters Meet the Real Ghostbusters, or whatever that was called, I thought was a really strange idea, because it's like, okay, you're taking the comic book Ghostbusters that are basically sort of the movie Ghostbusters, but they're also... But that book merges everything together. It takes its cues from every Ghostbusters thing that we've ever had and mashes it all together. Meets specifically one of the things that are part of that mashup, and it really didn't work for me. But then reading this, I started to feel like I was picking up on some subtleties in what's different between movie Ghostbusters, and of course the comic Ghostbusters are certainly closer to movie Ghostbusters than they are anything else, even though it's roping in all that lore. I started feeling like I was picking up on some subtle, nuanced differences between that version and the Real Ghostbusters, this version. The main obvious difference, of course, is that the ghosts they fight tend to be a lot sillier, and Burnham's done some really goofy ghosts, certainly, but there's a very Saturday morning cartoon quality to the ghosts here, and the banter is much more Saturday morning cartoon. I think that's a thing that I wasn't picking up as much on with the Ghostbusters Meet the Real Ghostbusters comic, and so I feel like when I go back and reread that and read the rest of it, I'll probably appreciate it a lot more. But that's one of the big differences, and that it's just a lot more punny. At the beginning of this, they fight or the beginning of the Ghostbusters part of it anyway. When we get past the flashback at the beginning, there's a bit where the Ghostbusters are fighting this big monster, and they keep making puns about nuts and trying to one-up each other and decide if anything anybody is saying is funny at all. And they're trying to make nutcracker jokes, and the whole joke is how difficult it is to come up with nut jokes. And that's kind of funny, because coming up with nut jokes in a thing that feels like it's kind of for kids without going anywhere to a sexual place. And now that I'm thinking about it, that is probably supposed to be part of the gag there, that if this were the regular Ghostbusters comic, oh, good job, Eric Burnham. I think that's actually something he's doing on purpose now that I'm thinking about it, that if this were the movies or did I say real Ghostbusters comic? I mean the Ghostbusters comics that aren't about the cartoon version, the real Ghostbusters. That gets confusing to try to say out loud. It probably would have gone to more of a sexual innuendo kind of place. So that's sort of fun. But also, obviously, these Ghostbusters run around with Slimer. And that's a big difference. So they just do really silly, goofy things. The flavor of this, very different, actually, from the besides the fact that it's all about the banter and the comedy is similar, it is very different from movie Ghostbusters and from from regular comic book Ghostbusters. So I'm glad I read this, because now I have more of an appreciation for what the difference is between those two things. But anyway, so what this book does is it says that the Martians from Mars attacked or tried to attack the Earth in 1938 because they heard the radio broadcast of War of the Worlds and thought that that was actually happening. And they decided to come down after the Martians, after... Oh, actually, that's weird, because aren't the aliens in that Martians? Oh, yes, they are. So the idea was, okay, so now I'm piecing this together. Okay, so the idea is they're confused because they weren't told about a Martian attack on Earth, and suddenly they hear this broadcast that sounds very real. And of course, there were a lot of people in 38 that when they heard Orson Welles on the radio thought it was really happening because of the way it was presented. And they come to Earth to be part of the attack, and nothing's going on. Everything seems kind of fine. And they end up later on haunting a farm. So after they die, their ghosts stick around. And so the reason that the Ghostbusters are involved in this is because they're not fighting aliens. They're just aliens. They're fighting the ghosts of aliens. This is a thing that I've always wanted to see more in Ghostbusters. Eric and I have talked about this a lot. The idea that if you had different... Of course, if you have aliens on other planets, they would have ghosts. And if you had alternate dimensions, then and you had like different planes of existence, you'd have different ghosts between different dimensions. So wouldn't it be cool if the Ghostbusters dealt with extra dimensional ghosts and also alien ghosts? There's this kind of fun bit where the Ghostbusters are bickering about whether or not aliens are real, and I like that joke because you contrast it to ghosts. Aliens feel like, to me, a much more plausible thing that you wouldn't even really argue about. Like if you're in a world where you know that on Earth the supernatural is possible, that feels way less far-fetched. You know that when people die, their souls stick around and sometimes haunt places and have ectoplasm and can throw that on people, and all these strange, bizarre things that people were in denial about forever and refused to believe existed, but in a world where that's your everyday life, there are other things that you haven't heard about yet that might seem far outside of the realm of possibility because you just haven't run into them yet, even though if you really think about it, one of these things sounds more far-fetched than the other. And I like that a lot. And I can't remember which Ghostbusters exactly were having a hard time getting their minds around that. I guess it was kind of Ray versus everybody else, because Ray says that before he was really into ghosts, he was really into science fiction and aliens and stuff, and that seems very much in his wheelhouse, and I buy that a lot. I would buy that for either version of Ray, certainly. So anyway, they go to this farm, and there's this elderly farmer who's very much your stereotypical kind of southern crotchety farmer, and of course they're in New Jersey, but he has this very old school kind of southern mentality. And this is the place where I thought that it was writing the line, I don't know too close, but it surprised me how much it rode the line between being an adult pulp throwback and being and basing itself on a children's cartoon, because there's a flashback where the farmer is talking about being a kid and trying to tell his father about the aliens, but his father getting angry with him because he thought he was just listening to the radio when he was supposed to be going to bed, and so he spanks him, and we get this big panel of him being spanked, and I don't think that's certainly not a thing that you would have seen on TV. I don't know, maybe you would have. I mean, I don't think you would now. I think times have changed a little bit, but I think, you know, some people would look at that and see that as graphic in a way. I don't know. We live in a different time where that is certainly considered less acceptable and more of a problem than it used to be, and certainly that's what would have happened with a lot of families at that time, and that's how parents would handle that. And not to get into, you know, the ethics of putting hands on children or whatever, but I just think it's kind of interesting that that's here, and that it's overall kind of an okay thing for kids to read. Like, I found myself with moments like that sort of wondering if it was intending to be, and I mean, of course, it's adults now that would remember the real Ghostbusters, but I'm just talking about tonally, if it's straight up trying to do the real Ghostbusters and Mars Attacks simultaneously, does it want to err more on the side of being a more adult thing like Mars Attacks, or a more kid-friendly thing like real Ghostbusters? And I think in places it's a little bit difficult to tell, but I think overall it does a pretty good job of blending those things. This is certainly an issue I would probably let my kid read. There's nothing vulgar about it. Certainly, it is a creepy, scary looking comic, and it ought to be, given that it's that, like I said, it's that sci-fi horror pulp throwback, but it doesn't do anything that's actually really terrifying. It just has that vibe about it. The ending, I think, is a little bit unsatisfying. The Ghostbusters kind of, the ghost Martians kind of beat themselves. The Ghostbusters take care of some of them, and then there's one that finds a spaceship again, and it's kind of fun that they get to see a flying saucer at the end of this. And the Martian gets in his spaceship and is gonna fly it back to Mars and try to regroup and probably come back and attack the Earth. And it turns out that the self-destruct mechanism, I guess it was like turned on, but then the ship like shut down and went dormant, and so when it came back on, the countdown starts again, and then he flies it up into the air, and then it explodes, and the end. And the Ghostbusters win the way the Ghostbusters always win, where they just pull out their proton wands and fire away and get the ghosts in the traps, and that's about it. So there's not a lot of anything impressive the Ghostbusters do having to use ingenuity or resourcefulness or anything, and so it really is kind of just a typical cartoon adventure, but that initial idea that the Martians show up because they hear a radio broadcast and think they're supposed to be attacking the Earth, I think is kind of inspired and a really funny idea. Certainly a thing that we've seen before in various things. You look at stuff like Galaxy Quest and things like that, where you have aliens on other planets who think that our entertainment is real. That's a thing that we've used a lot, but this was kind of a fun new spin on that. And then you've got your typical kind of epilogue conclusion where oh no, there's another one still around, and Slimer notices it, nobody else. The end. And of course, there hasn't been a follow-up of this, and I wouldn't expect a follow-up. And what would you do with it besides just maybe, I don't know, the Martian ghosts wreaking havoc on the city, or someplace where more people notice it or something, and then the Ghostbusters show up and use their proton wands and get them in the trap, in the end. So it's kind of just your typical stinger kind of ending. All in all, I really enjoyed this. A lot of fun. More just silly kind of escapist and throwback entertainment, but this was a mashup that worked really well for me tonally, and I didn't read any of the other Mars Attacks books. We've been doing this a lot with IDW, where they'll take a couple properties they have and mash them up, and or rather they'll take one property and mash it with one-shots or miniseries with several of their other properties, and we did this with Ghostbusters, or was it X-Files? We did this with X-Files. With the lone gunman going around to various. I talked about this with New Comic Reviews when that was out, going to various books, and the difference there, I guess, is that there was more of a through line between them all. I'm not seeing really any kind of a through line here. Maybe there is, and I'd have to read them all to notice it. But the next one after this was Transformers, and I wonder how you'd mix those two things together. I felt the same way with that as I feel the same way about that as I do with a lot of the Transformers mashups, where it's like, wow, I don't even know how you do that. Putting Star Trek with Transformers or Ghostbusters with I don't even know what you do. But anyway, so I may take a look at some point at some of the other Mars Attacks mashups. I tried the first couple issues of, or maybe just the first issue, I forget, of Mars Attacks when IDW first got it, and wasn't real impressed. I didn't keep going with it, but pulp sci-fi horror is not immediately something I go to, so it might just have been not for me. I thought it was dripping with atmosphere, and I loved the look of that book, but the story didn't really grab me. So this, admittedly, I'm enjoying more for the real Ghostbusters side of it, but the Martians in this context are super fun. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. Sure appreciate it, and I will see you again shortly with more Comic Vaults. I am Captain Logan, and happy reading.